I'm 70 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought being a good mother meant putting my children's needs before my own no matter what. I thought it meant making sacrifices without complaint, offering help without being asked, and trusting that love would be returned with respect. I was wrong. What I learned instead was the difference between being a loving mother and being a doormat. And that lesson cost my children 3 properties worth over $500,000. My name is Dorothy, and this is the story of how I went from being financially exploited by my own family to reclaiming not just my money but my dignity. It started with what seemed like an act of generosity and ended with me sitting in a lawyer's office, signing papers that would change everything. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. My son Robert's voice carried that particular tone of excitement mixed with urgency that I'd learned to recognize over the years. He and Sarah had found their dream house. 4 bedrooms, perfect neighborhood. Excellent schools for the grandchildren. The only problem was timing. They needed to close in 30 days, but their current house wouldn't sell for at least 2 months. The amount he mentioned, $45,000, represented nearly half of my life savings, money I'd accumulated through 30 years of careful budgeting, working part-time jobs even after qualifying for Social Security, setting aside every spare dollar for emergencies or unexpected medical bills. Money that represented security for a 70-year-old widow living alone. But Robert was my eldest, and he'd always been responsible. His wife Sarah taught elementary school, he worked in accounting, and they had 2 children who drew me pictures that I kept pinned to my refrigerator. The request felt reasonable, temporary. Family. Helping family. I heard myself agreeing before I'd fully processed the implications. My friend Margaret had worked in banking before retirement, and when she reviewed the promissory note Robert brought for me to sign, her expression grew concerned. The document was simple. Too simple. It specified the loan amount and a modest interest rate, but lacked proper collateral or enforcement mechanisms. Margaret suggested I should at least have a lien on the new property, but I brushed off her concerns. This was family, after all. Robert wouldn't cheat his own mother. That assumption would prove to be my first mistake. The early months proceeded exactly as promised. Robert and Sarah moved into their new house, sent me photos of the children in their new bedrooms, and put their old house on the market. I received a thank you card that sat proudly on my mantelpiece next to graduation photos and birthday pictures. But as summer turned to fall, the promised sale kept getting delayed. First it was inspection issues, then buyer financing problems, then the deal fell through entirely. Each month brought another phone call with another explanation, another apology, another vague promise that everything would be resolved soon. I wanted to believe Robert's explanations, and mostly I did. The real estate market was unpredictable. These things happened, and he'd never lied to me about anything important before. At least not that I knew of. Margaret was the one who first noticed the pattern I was missing. During our Saturday morning walk through the neighborhood park, she mentioned seeing Robert's old house listed with yet another real estate agent. The 4th one in 6 months. More puzzling, the listing price kept increasing rather than decreasing to attract buyers. That evening, I drove past the house for the first time since Robert had moved. What I saw made my stomach clench with dread. The yard was overgrown. Mail overflowed from the mailbox, and a notice was taped to the front door. I couldn't read it from the street, but I recognized the look of a property in distress. When I called Robert the next morning to ask about the house's condition, his explanation came too quickly, too smoothly. They'd decided to rent it out instead of selling, he said. The rental income would help them pay me back faster. This was news to me, and I wondered why such a significant change in plans hadn't been discussed beforehand. The first rental payment from tenants never materialized because, as I would later discover, there were no tenants. Robert and Sarah had never seriously attempted to sell the house. Instead, they'd let it sit empty while enjoying their upgrade to the new neighborhood, hoping somehow the situation would resolve itself without their having to make difficult choices. But that day I simply felt confused and hurt. Robert promised to start making small payments immediately, even before finding renters. The first payment arrived 2 weeks later. $500 with a note thanking me for my patience. It wasn't much against a $45,000 debt, but it felt like progress proof that Robert understood his obligation to me. The second payment never came. When I called to inquire, Sarah answered with a strained voice. Robert was working long hours, she explained. His company was restructuring, and they weren't sure about his job security. Emma needed braces and insurance only covered part of the cost. These were legitimate concerns, but they were also Robert and Sarah's responsibilities, not mine. The fact that they seemed to be prioritizing everything else over repaying me was becoming impossible to ignore. Robert's tone when I finally reached him had shifted from apologetic to defensive. I was putting too much pressure on them, he suggested. Maybe if I weren't so demanding about the payments, they could focus on getting back on their feet. The word pressure stung. I'd asked about 2 missed payments on a $45,000 loan. And somehow, I was the problem. Instead of standing my ground, I found myself apologizing. I didn't want to add to their stress, I said. I was just worried about my own finances. Robert assured me they would make everything right. They just needed more time. Time stretched on. Fall became winter. Winter became spring. And my attempts to discuss repayment were met with increasingly creative excuses. Robert's job situation. Sarah's health problems, unexpected house repairs, the children's activities. There was always something more pressing than paying back the money they owed me. Meanwhile, my own financial situation was deteriorating. I canceled my cable subscription, started shopping at discount grocery stores, and postponed dental work I couldn't afford. The irony was bitter. I was struggling financially so my son and his family could live comfortably in a house I'd helped them buy. Margaret was less diplomatic in her observations. They were taking advantage of me, she said bluntly. Anyone could see it except me. I insisted they were just having a hard time, that once things improved, everything would be fine. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect that Robert and Sarah had no intention of paying me back at all. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in June. I was balancing my checkbook, trying to figure out how to afford both my property tax payment and my prescription medications, when my daughter Lisa called with exciting news. Her husband David had received a promotion, and they were finally ready to buy their first house. Unlike Robert, Lisa and David had never asked me for financial help. They'd handled David's unemployment, their daughter's medical expenses, and their car repairs, without expecting family bailouts. But now they needed help with a down payment. Just $15,000 to make their dream of homeownership possible. $15,000. I had exactly $16,000 left in my savings account after lending Robert $45,000 and living off my diminished income for over a year. When I explained that I didn't have the money available, Lisa's response revealed something that hit me like a physical blow. She seemed genuinely surprised, mentioning that Robert had told the family I was comfortable financially. Not only had my children been discussing my finances among themselves, but Robert had apparently misrepresented my situation to justify his failure to repay me. What Lisa told me next made everything worse. Robert and Sarah had just bought an expensive new car and were talking about renovating their kitchen. While I was postponing medical care and eating generic cereal for dinner, they were making major purchases and planning luxury improvements to the house I'd helped them buy. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the casual way Lisa had mentioned Robert's assumption about my finances, the easy confidence with which he'd taken on new debt while ignoring his obligation to me. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to get my money back, whatever it took. The first person I called was Margaret. I needed help, I told her. I needed to know my options. Margaret arrived within an hour, bringing a yellow legal pad and the no-nonsense attitude that had made her successful in banking. She listened without judgment as I told her everything. The worthless promissory note, the house that was never really for sale, the missed payments and endless excuses. When I finished, Margaret set down her pen and looked at me directly. What Robert and Sarah had done constituted elder financial abuse, she explained. It was a crime in this state, and there were laws specifically designed to protect people in my situation. The words elder financial abuse hit me like cold water. I didn't think of myself as elderly, but I was 70 years old and I had been systematically manipulated by people who were supposed to love and protect me. Margaret outlined my options: demand letters, lawsuits, legal enforcement of the promissory note. But before discussing legal action, Margaret wanted me to consider something else. If Robert's old house was still sitting empty and they were paying mortgages on 2 properties while claiming they couldn't afford to pay me back, they were probably in serious financial trouble. People don't usually let houses sit empty unless they can't afford to maintain them properly. This information should have made me feel sympathetic. Instead, it made me feel something I'd never experienced before when thinking about my children: strategic. If Robert and Sarah were financially vulnerable, that vulnerability could be leveraged to get my money back. That afternoon, we sat in the office of James Morrison, an attorney Margaret had worked with during her banking career. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he explained that while my promissory note wasn't perfect, it was still a legal document that established Robert's debt to me. With the right legal pressure, it could be enforced. More importantly, if Robert and Sarah were struggling financially, they might be motivated to negotiate rather than face a lawsuit that would further damage their credit and potentially expose them to additional legal consequences. Morrison asked me to think carefully about what I hoped to achieve. Was this primarily about getting my money back or about making a point about how they'd treated me? Both, I told him. I needed the money. I couldn't afford to write off $45,000. But I also needed them to understand that I wasn't a bank they could borrow from without consequences. Morrison recommended starting with a formal demand letter. It would make clear that I was serious about collecting this debt, and it would give Robert and Sarah a chance to respond appropriately before we escalated to legal action. The demand letter was delivered 3 days later. It was professional, detailed, and unambiguous, laying out the facts of the loan, the missed payments, and the consequences of continued non-payment. It gave Robert and Sarah 30 days to respond with either full payment or a concrete repayment plan. Robert called within 2 hours of receiving the letter. His voice was tight with anger and hurt. He couldn't believe I'd hired a lawyer, he said. We were family. We could have worked this out between ourselves. But we'd been trying to work it out for over a year, I reminded him. I hadn't heard from him for weeks at a time, and when I did, it was always another excuse about why he couldn't pay me back. Robert mentioned that things were turning around. Sarah was getting her real estate license. His job situation was more stable. These were the same types of vague promises I'd been hearing for months. Armed with legal backing and Margaret's support, I found myself responding differently than I had in the past. I was glad things were improving for him, I said, but I needed more than promises. I needed a realistic repayment schedule that we both signed, or I needed the full amount paid back. When Robert protested that they didn't have $45,000 just sitting around, I suggested he might consider refinancing one of his properties or selling the old house. The long pause that followed told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he'd been taking this debt. His final question revealed so much about how he'd been thinking about the situation. Would I really take their house? In his mind, it was his house bought with his credit and his income. The fact that it was also bought with my money seemed to be an inconvenient detail he'd chosen to forget. I didn't want to take anyone's house, I told him. I wanted my money back. The money he'd promised to repay over a year ago. After that conversation, the dynamic in our family shifted dramatically. Where Robert had once been casual about our financial arrangement, he was now urgently focused on damage control. Where I had once been apologetic about asking for updates, I was now matter-of-fact about my expectations. My youngest son, Michael, called a few days later, having heard about the situation from Robert. Didn't I think getting lawyers involved was a little extreme? Michael had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find compromise solutions. I asked Michael to consider how he would handle a similar situation with a friend. If he lent someone $45,000 and they stopped making payments without explanation, what would he do? Michael said that was different. Robert wasn't a friend, he was my son. Exactly, I replied. He was my son, which meant he should be treating me better than he would treat a friend, not worse. This seemed to catch Michael off guard. I'd been thinking about it a lot lately. I explained. I'd raised 3 children to be honest, responsible, and respectful. When you borrow money, you pay it back. When you make a promise, you keep it. These weren't complicated concepts. Michael worried about what this might do to my relationship with Robert and Sarah, and what about the grandchildren? This was the fear that had kept me silent for so long. The fear that standing up for myself would cost me relationships with people I loved. But I was beginning to understand that I'd already lost those relationships the moment I allowed myself to be taken advantage of. What kind of relationship did I have with Robert right now? One where he lied to me, ignored my calls, and treated my financial support as an entitlement rather than a gift. What kind of example was that setting for the grandchildren? That weekend brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah showed up at my door Saturday morning looking tired and stressed, clearly, having been crying. When I invited her in, she immediately broke down again, apologizing for how badly they'd handled everything. This was the first genuine apology I'd received from anyone in Robert's family, and it caught me off guard. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed the promissory note that started this mess. And Sarah's honesty was refreshing, but also revealing. She admitted that I was right to be angry that they'd made terrible decisions about money. She'd been the one pushing for the bigger house, the better neighborhood. When I asked whether they'd ever discussed how their financial decisions would affect their ability to pay me back, Sarah looked down at her coffee cup and admitted they hadn't really thought about it. The debt to me had always felt like something they'd deal with later when things settled down. Later had become never, and we both knew it. Sarah's admission confirmed what I'd suspected. They'd never taken the loan seriously because they'd never taken me seriously. I was grandma. The person who would always be there no matter how they treated me. I explained to Sarah that I wasn't trying to hurt their family, but I couldn't keep subsidizing their lifestyle while I struggled to pay my own bills. When she asked what kind of sacrifices I'd been making, I told her about the dental work I'd postponed, the medications I'd skipped, the grocery budget I'd cut to the bone. About lying awake at night worrying about what would happen if I got sick and couldn't work. The part-time job that was barely keeping me afloat. Sarah was crying again by the time I finished. She had no idea, she said. Robert had told her I was fine financially, that the loan wasn't a hardship for me. This was perhaps the most revealing thing Sarah could have said. Robert had not only minimized their debt to me, he'd actively misrepresented my financial situation to justify their failure to repay me. I needed that money back, I told Sarah. Not just for my financial security, but because this had changed how I saw myself and my relationship with my children. I needed to know that I was valued as more than just a source of emergency funding. Sarah asked what I needed from them specifically. Robert had been talking about borrowing from his $401,000 or getting a second mortgage, but neither option was realistic given their current situation. This was the opening I'd been hoping for. A genuine acknowledgement that they needed to take concrete action, not just make more promises. I needed a realistic repayment plan with specific dates and amounts, I explained. And I needed some kind of security to make sure the plan would actually be followed. Morrison had mentioned that we could put a lien on one of their properties. Sarah's face went pale at the mention of a lien. It would show up on their credit report, she worried. But their credit report was already showing 2 mortgages they could barely afford, I pointed out. A lien to secure a debt they already owed wouldn't make things worse. It would just make them honest. After Sarah left, I felt both hopeful and exhausted. Hopeful because she seemed genuinely committed to finding a solution, exhausted because I was 70 years old and shouldn't have to be fighting my own family for basic respect and honesty. Margaret stopped by that evening to check on me. I kept thinking about something I told her. For months, I'd been worried about what this conflict would do to my relationships with my children. But I was starting to realize that my relationships with my children were already damaged. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who take the biggest advantage of that love, Margaret observed. I'd raised my children to be better than this, I said. I knew I had. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I'd raised them to be good people, she agreed. But somewhere along the way, they'd learned that they could treat me differently than they would treat other people. Maybe because I'd let them. This was a hard truth, but one I needed to hear. I had trained my children to see me as endlessly accommodating, eternally forgiving, always available to clean up their messes. In doing so, I'd inadvertently taught them that I didn't deserve the same consideration they would show to friends, employers, or even strangers. The next week brought the response I'd been waiting for. Morrison called to let me know that Robert's lawyer had contacted him with a proposed settlement agreement. They were offering to pay me back over 3 years, $15,000 annually with interest. They were also willing to secure the debt with a lien on the new house. It wasn't ideal. I would have preferred immediate repayment, but it was realistic and legally enforceable. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how Robert and Sarah were treating their obligation to me. Morrison thought it was a reasonable offer. The lien provided real security, and the payment schedule was aggressive enough to suggest they were taking the situation seriously. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to sign the formal agreement. As I hung up the phone, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not just because I was going to get my money back, but because I was going to get my self-respect back too. The meeting took place in Morrison's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert and Sarah arrived with their lawyer, a middle-aged woman who looked as tired as her clients. The atmosphere was formal and somewhat tense, but not hostile. As we reviewed the settlement agreement, I watched my son's face. He looked older than I remembered, worn down by stress and financial pressure. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort him, to tell him we could forget about the whole thing and go back to the way things used to be. But I didn't, because I'd finally learned the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. Real support sometimes meant holding people accountable for their choices, even when it was uncomfortable for everyone involved. The agreement was straightforward. Robert and Sarah would pay me $15,000 by the end of each year for 3 years with 6% interest. They would secure the debt with a lien on their new house, which meant they couldn't sell or refinance without paying me back first. If they missed a payment, I had the right to foreclose on the lien and force a sale of the property. As we signed the documents, Robert looked up at me and apologized. He said he understood how badly they'd handled the situation. It wasn't a complete apology. He didn't acknowledge the lies, the manipulation, or the impact his actions had had on my life. But it was a start. And at 70 years old, I'd learned to appreciate incremental progress. Over the following months, our family slowly began to rebuild trust. The first payment arrived exactly on schedule, accompanied by a note from Sarah thanking me for my patience. Robert started calling more regularly, and our conversations gradually moved beyond financial matters to more normal family topics. But something fundamental had changed in our relationship. Where I had once been eager to offer help and support, I was now more measured in my responses. Where I had once accepted their word without question, I now asked for details and verification. Where I had once prioritized their comfort over my own needs, I now insisted on reciprocity and respect. Some family members initially saw this change as coldness or resentment. My daughter Lisa worried that I was holding a grudge that would poison family relationships for years to come. When she asked if it wasn't time to forgive and forget, I explained that I did forgive them, but forgetting would be a mistake. The whole point of this experience was to learn from it. I'd learned that I'd taught my children to treat me badly by accepting bad treatment for so long. If I wanted to be treated with respect, I had to insist on it. Most people don't realize that unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional bad behavior. That's not love. That's martyrdom. And martyrdom doesn't actually help anyone. The second payment arrived early with another note from Sarah. She'd gotten her real estate license and was already earning commissions. Robert had received a promotion at work. Their financial situation was stabilizing, partly because they were no longer carrying the debt burden of 2 mortgages they couldn't afford. This improvement vindicated the approach Morrison and Margaret had recommended. By forcing Robert and Sarah to face the consequences of their financial decisions, we'd actually helped them develop better money management skills and more realistic expectations about what they could afford. The old house had finally been sold at a loss, but for enough to pay off the remaining mortgage. Robert called to let me know, and for the first time in 2 years, he sounded genuinely optimistic about the future. They should be able to pay me back ahead of schedule. He said maybe by the end of next year, instead of spreading it over 3 years. I told him that would be wonderful, but not to put themselves in a difficult position just to accelerate the payments. He assured me they'd learned their lesson about overextending themselves financially. As my 70th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the lessons of the past 2 years. I'd learned that being a good mother didn't mean being endlessly self-sacrificing. I'd learned that family relationships required the same boundaries and expectations as any other relationships. Most importantly, I'd learned that standing up for myself didn't make me selfish, it made me stronger. Margaret threw me a small birthday party inviting friends from church and our walking group. As I looked around the table at these women who had supported me through one of the most difficult periods of my life, I realized that I'd gained something valuable in the process of recovering my $45,000. I'd gained a clearer understanding of what real friendship looked like, what genuine support felt like, and what I was willing to accept from the people in my life going forward. Robert and Sarah attended the party, bringing the grandchildren and a beautiful flower arrangement. The children ran around my backyard, their laughter filling the air with joy and normalcy. For a few hours it felt like old times. But as the evening wound down, Robert approached me privately with a fuller apology than he'd offered before. He was sorry not just about the money, but about how they'd treated me. I deserved better from them, he said. He wanted me to know that they'd been talking to the children about respect and responsibility, about keeping promises and treating people fairly, especially family. This was perhaps the most important outcome of our whole ordeal. My grandchildren were learning lessons about integrity and accountability that might prevent them from making the same mistakes their parents had made. The final payment arrived 11 months early, along with a card signed by Robert Sarah, and both children. Inside was a photo of all of us from the birthday party, with a handwritten note thanking me for teaching them what it really means to be family. As I deposited the check and marked paid in full on my copy of the settlement agreement, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The money was important. It restored my financial security and gave me peace of mind about my future. But the real victory was the restoration of my self-respect and the establishment of healthier relationships with my children. 3 months later, Lisa called with news that she and David were ready to start house hunting seriously. They'd been pre-approved for a mortgage and had saved most of what they needed for a down payment, but they were still about $10,000 short. The conversation that followed was fundamentally different from the one I'd had with Robert 2 years earlier. Lisa acknowledged that I might not be comfortable lending money after everything that had happened with Robert. She emphasized that they had alternatives. They could wait another year or look at less expensive houses. She asked what I would need in terms of repayment structure and security. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where Robert had presented his request as an emergency requiring immediate action, Lisa was giving me time to think. Where Robert had minimized the risks and obligations, Lisa was acknowledging them up front. Where Robert had relied on emotional manipulation, Lisa was treating this as a business transaction between family members who cared about each other. After several days of consideration and consultation with Morrison, I decided to help Lisa and David. But this time we did everything correctly. We drafted a formal loan agreement with specific payment dates and amounts, included penalties for late payments, and secured the debt with a lien on the house they would purchase. The closing on Lisa's house became a celebration of how family financial relationships could work when they were structured properly and approached with respect and transparency. Lisa and David treated me as both a family member and a business partner, which felt exactly right. Their payments arrived like clockwork, always on time, always accompanied by brief notes updating me on family news. This consistency allowed me to plan for my own future rather than just surviving month to month. I enrolled in watercolor classes I'd wanted to take for years, started taking weekend trips to visit friends, and began setting aside money for my own long-term care. My relationship with Robert continued to evolve positively as well. With the financial stress removed and clear boundaries established, we were able to rebuild trust gradually. When my air conditioning broke during a summer heat wave, he insisted on paying for the repairs, refusing to let me handle the expense myself. These small gestures of consideration meant more to me than grand apologies or expensive gifts. Sarah's transformation was equally dramatic. She began calling regularly for genuine conversation and advice. When she received her first major real estate commission, she insisted on taking me out for a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. She wanted me to know that our experience had changed how she thought about family relationships. She never wanted to take anyone's generosity for granted again. As my 73rd birthday approached, I marveled at how much my life had changed. I was financially secure, emotionally stronger, and more confident about my place in my family and community. I had learned to distinguish between being loving and being used, between being supportive and being taken advantage of. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that standing up for myself didn't damage my relationships with my children. It improved them. By refusing to accept disrespectful treatment, I had taught my family to treat me better. By insisting on accountability, I had helped them become more responsible. By protecting my own interests, I had actually strengthened our family bonds. The larger birthday party that year included all three of my children and their families. As I watched my grandchildren playing and listened to the easy conversation flowing around my dining room table, I was struck by how different this normal felt from the old normal. Where family gatherings used to be marked by underlying tensions about money and obligations, there was now mutual respect and clear boundaries. Where conversations used to be careful dances around unspoken resentments, there was now honest communication and genuine affection. During the party, Michael approached me with a confession that surprised me. When everything was happening with Robert, he'd thought I was being too harsh. He'd believed families should forgive and forget, and he'd worried I was holding grudges that would damage relationships permanently. Now he realized I'd been teaching all of them how to treat each other better. His children had been asking him about respect and responsibility lately, and he thought they'd learned more from watching how I handled the situation than they would have from dozens of lectures. This was exactly the outcome I'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. My grandchildren were learning that love and respect weren't mutually exclusive, that family relationships required the same consideration and accountability as any other relationships. As the evening wound down, Lisa approached me with an intriguing proposal. She and David were going to be able to pay off their loan early, probably within 6 months. But they didn't want this to be the end of our financial relationship. They wanted to talk about me investing with them in a rental property. This represented a complete reversal of the traditional parent-child financial dynamic. Instead of Lisa asking for help, she was offering me an investment opportunity. Instead of seeing me simply as a source of emergency funding, she valued my financial partnership. The duplex they had identified would be perfect for rental income. They had most of the money for the down payment but needed a partner for the rest. I would be a silent partner providing capital while they handled management and maintenance. They projected about 8% annual return, better than savings accounts or CDs, plus potential appreciation over time. The more we discussed Lisa's proposal, the more interested I became. It offered me a chance to diversify my investments, earn better returns, and maintain a business relationship with my daughter based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided support. After consulting with my financial advisor, who was cautiously optimistic about the numbers and Lisa's track record of reliability, I decided to move forward. We spent several weeks negotiating a formal partnership agreement that protected everyone's interests while establishing clear procedures for managing the investment. The closing on the duplex took place on a crisp October morning. As I signed the documents that made me a real estate investor for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with helping my children and everything to do with building my own financial future. The monthly rental reports that began arriving 6 weeks later became something I looked forward to. Lisa and David were thorough and transparent, treating me as a genuine business partner rather than a silent benefactor. When one tenant moved out, they consulted with me about the rental rate. When the roof needed repairs, they shared multiple estimates before proceeding. This level of communication and respect represented everything that had been missing from my financial relationship with Robert. Where that experience had taught me to be defensive and suspicious, this partnership was teaching me to be collaborative and confident. As I reviewed the latest property report one evening in May, updating my own financial records, I realized something remarkable had happened. For the first time in my adult life, I was financially independent, not because I was avoiding risks, but because I was managing them intelligently. I had money in savings for emergencies, reliable income from multiple sources, and investments that were growing over time. I had legal protections in place for all my financial relationships, and I had the knowledge and confidence to make informed decisions about my money. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned to value myself enough to insist on being treated with respect and consideration by the people I loved. This transformation had cost Robert and Sarah their assumption that they could take advantage of my generosity without consequences. It had cost me some illusions about unconditional family loyalty, but it had gained me something far more valuable: the knowledge that at 73 years old I was still capable of growing, learning, and changing. I was still capable of standing up for myself, building new relationships, and creating the life I wanted, rather than simply accepting the life others expected me to live. The lesson I learned at 70 was simple but profound. Real love requires boundaries. Genuine respect demands accountability. And the best gift you can give your family is showing them how to treat you well. It took 3 properties and countless sleepless nights to learn that lesson, but it was worth every difficult moment. Teaching my children to respect me taught them to respect themselves and each other. And that legacy is worth more than any amount of money I could have left them.